The strongest girl in the academy was on her knees. Her sword lay 3 paces away in the churned dirt of the training arena. Her lower lip had split open, a thin line of blood tracing down to her chin, and her ribs pulled tight with every breath. But it was her eyes that told the real story. Her eyes could not stop moving. They flickered up, then away, then up again, unable to hold on the boy standing over her. That boy was Ian Purkis, and exactly 7 days ago, Ian Purkis had been nobody at all. He could not last 10 seconds against Celia Yordina in a duel. He could barely swing a training sword without losing his footing. He was a low-ranking noble from a countryside so forgotten that half the instructors could not place his family on a map. Teachers gave him passing grades because failing him felt cruel. Classmates walked past him without noticing he had entered the room. And yet the entire arena had just watched him drop the school prodigy with a single cold stare. Nobody in that crowd understood what they had witnessed. Nobody could explain how the weakest sword in the second year had crushed the youngest aura expert in living memory. And nobody, not a single student or instructor, knew the secret that Ian himself did not yet know. 7 days earlier, on an ordinary night in his dormitory, Ian had lost consciousness. He had not woken up for a full week. And during those 7 days, something else had been walking around inside his body. Something colder. Something that already knew how to kill. To understand what happened in that arena, the clock had to rewind. All the way back to the morning Ian opened his eyes for what he believed was the first time in 8 hours. The sun through his window felt too bright. His head throbbed with a dull, insistent pressure that pushed against the back of his eyes. Ian groaned and turned onto his side, half convinced that the wine at his dorm gathering the night before had been cheaper than his friends had promised. He pressed one palm against his temple and tried to remember how many cups he had drunk. 2, maybe 3. Not enough to justify this kind of pain. He shrugged the thought aside, blamed his own weak tolerance, and tried to sit up. That was when he saw the papers on his desk. They should not have been there. Ian was a tidy person by habit. He always cleared his workspace before sleep. He had gone to bed with nothing on that desk except an oil lamp and a book he had been meaning to return to the library. Now there were sheets of parchment stacked in a neat pile, a wax seal glinting on top of them, and a hand mirror turned face down that he did not remember owning. His stomach twisted with a small, uncomfortable feeling, but he pushed it away and reached for the closest sheet. The calendar on his wall caught his eye first. Ian froze with his hand halfway to the desk. The date was wrong. It was wrong by 7 full days. His finger traced across the marked squares, counting once, then a second time, then a third. The math did not change. A week of his life had vanished while he slept. Ian stood up so fast that the pain in his head doubled. He gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself and stared at that calendar as if staring hard enough would move the numbers back. It did not. He turned in place, scanning his room for any explanation, and his eyes landed on the sealed letter waiting for him. The seal was unfamiliar. He did not recognize the crest pressed into the red wax, and he did not remember receiving any letter, and he certainly did not remember bringing one back to his dormitory. He picked it up carefully. The parchment felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. Ian broke the seal with his thumbnail and unfolded the pages inside. The handwriting stopped him before the words did. It was a woman's hand, careful and elegant, with a slight forward slant that suggested she had been trained in one of the northern academies. Ian stared at it for a long moment. He could not think of any woman at the school who would send him a letter, sealed or otherwise. He was not the kind of boy who received love notes. He was not the kind of boy that girls remembered. He began to read anyway. The letter opened with a childhood story he had never heard, about a village he had never visited. Then it drifted into a list of names he did not recognize, though a few of them caught in his memory the way a hook catches a coat. The name Sophia appeared near the end, written in a hand that trembled slightly on the S. There were fragments about a bride, a hunting festival, demonic beasts, and something the writer called the collapse of the world. Ian read those last words twice. His skin cooled. He looked at the date at the bottom of the page. The year printed there was 3 full cycles ahead of the imperial calendar on his wall. Ian let out a slow breath and laughed. It was a small, unsteady laugh, the kind that came out of a person who wanted very badly to believe that the joke was on him. Someone in the academy had gone to a great deal of trouble to pull a prank. That was the only explanation that made any kind of sense. The date was fake, the names were fake. The warning about the world ending was the most obvious tell of all. Nobody wrote a real love letter that ended in an apocalypse. He crumpled the letter into a tight ball and dropped it into the wastebasket beside his desk. Then he picked up his uniform, because he was already late for morning class, and he decided that the 7 missing days on the calendar were probably a printing error the dorm supervisor had failed to correct. That decision would haunt him within the hour. The courtyard felt strange the moment Ian stepped into it. He noticed it before he could name it. Students moved differently around him. A pair of first-years glanced at him, then at each other, and then hurried away toward the far arch. A group near the fountain stopped talking as he passed, and one of them tugged the sleeve of another to keep him quiet. Ian slowed his walk and touched the axe at his hip. Then he stopped completely. He did not own an axe. He had never owned an axe. He had never held one long enough to know its weight. And yet there was a hand axe hanging from his belt, held in a leather loop he did not remember buckling on. Its handle was worn smooth by use he had never given it. Ian stared down at that axe as a cold thread began to work its way up the back of his neck. Someone called his name from across the yard. He looked up in relief. Leto and Celine were walking toward the practice field together, and Leto had waved him over the way he always did when he wanted to be seen calling out to a friend. Ian raised a hand in greeting and started toward them, and then Leto looked directly at him and turned to Celine and began to talk about the weather. Celine nodded along and pretended very hard that Ian was not there. Neither of them met his eyes. Ian caught up to them anyway. He touched Leto's shoulder, and his oldest friend flinched away from the contact as if a hot coal had brushed his skin. Leto stopped, turned, and looked at Ian with an expression Ian had never seen on his face before. It was the expression of a man checking whether something inside a locked cage was still inside the cage. Leto studied him from 3 different angles, in complete silence, while Celine took a full step backward and kept her hand near the grip of her practice sword. The tension broke when Leto's face split into a wide, watery grin. He grabbed Ian by the shoulders, and then hugged him, and then shouted loud enough for half the courtyard to hear that his friend had been freed from the evil spirit. Ian tried to pull away, more confused than embarrassed, and asked what Leto was talking about. That was when the two of them began to explain the last 7 days of his life. Ian had not been himself. Ian had been someone else entirely. For the entire week that Ian did not remember, another version of him had walked the academy grounds, had treated Leto and Celine like servants, had ruined the small reputation their friend group had spent 2 years building, and had threatened both of them with a hand axe whenever they tried to intervene. The two of them had not called for exorcists only because the impostor had promised, with a cold and quiet certainty, that he would kill anyone who tried to remove him. Celine said that she had not been able to sleep properly for 3 nights. Leto said the impostor had smiled only once, and that had been the worst part. Ian listened. He touched the axe at his hip again. He asked them, in a voice that felt hollow inside his own throat, whether this was the axe they were talking about. Both of them stepped back at the sight of it. Celine told him to hide it. She said the weapon brought back memories she was not ready to look at yet. Leto agreed without meeting the axe's eye, which was a strange thing to notice, but Ian noticed it anyway. Ian tucked the axe behind him under his coat. He asked what else the impostor had done. He was not sure he wanted the answer. Celine glanced at Leto, and Leto glanced at the arena beyond the practice field, and then Celine told him, in the flat voice people used when they wanted to get a bad thing out quickly, that he had defeated Celia Yordina in a duel. He had put her in the hospital for a week. He had done it in front of the entire second-year class, and he had done it so thoroughly that not one of the spectators had cheered. Ian took a long moment to arrange this information inside his head. Celia Yordina was the youngest aura expert to enroll in the academy in 9 years. She was the heir presumptive of a northern family whose name closed doors and opened others across the empire. She had never lost a duel since she had learned to hold a sword. And Ian, the version of Ian that Ian himself did not know existed, had put her in a hospital bed for 7 days. Celine put a hand on his arm. Her voice was quieter now. She reminded him that today was the day of the rematch. Celia had demanded it the moment she was released from her ward. The instructors had scheduled it for the morning session, and there was no way to postpone it now, because a Yordina did not accept the shame of a delayed duel. Ian was going to have to fight her again. In less than an hour, the blood left Ian's face in one long, unhurried draw. He tried to think of a way out. There was none. Forfeiting cost points. Points affected class rank. Class rank affected everything else in the academy, from dormitory placement to instructor attention to which internships opened up in the 3rd year. He could not afford to lose points. He also could not survive Celia's sword. The imposter version of him had done that. The real version of him had never dodged a strike from her in his life. While Ian was still working through the math of his own impending humiliation, the instructor with the scarred arm crossed the field and called the class to order. He gestured Ian and Celia into the arena. He announced, in the same bored tone he used for every duel, that the match would be graded, and that both parties had already agreed to the rules. Ian's stomach tightened. He had agreed to nothing. But whoever had been living in his body 7 days ago had agreed on his behalf, and that was going to have to be enough. Ian stepped into the ring and looked at Celia for the first time. She was already staring at him. Her sword was already in her hand. There was something in her face that had not been there in any of the training sessions Ian had watched from the back of the hall. It was not anger. Anger was loud. This was the quiet after anger, the flat and dangerous place people went when their pride had been shredded, and they did not intend to leave that place until they had shredded something in return. Ian tried to swallow. His throat had gone dry. He decided, as calmly as he could manage, that his only strategy was to survive. He would endure her attacks for 10 minutes. That was the minimum time the graded portion required. 10 minutes of not dying. He would take his losses, hand her the victory, and walk out of the arena on his own 2 feet. That was the plan. It was not a good plan. It was the only plan he had. The instructor raised his hand. He held it there for 1 breath, then 2, and then Celia was already in front of him. Ian did not see her cross the arena. He did not see her raise her sword. He felt the impact of the strike before he understood the strike had happened, and then he was airborne, and the arena floor was falling away beneath him, and the crowd was a smeared line of open mouths at the edge of his vision. He hit the dirt outside the ring shoulder first, rolled twice, and came to rest on his back staring at a very ordinary sky. His entire plan had lasted less than 1 full second. The instructor's voice called something from the arena. Ian did not catch the words. His ears were ringing. He turned his head sideways and saw Celia at the center of the ring, her sword lowered, her expression unchanged. She was waiting for him to stand. She had not even bothered to pursue him out of the arena. She knew he was going to come back in. He was going to come back in, because if he did not, she was going to demand another rematch tomorrow, and another the day after. She was not going to let him leave the academy until she had done to him what his imposter had done to her. Ian understood that as clearly as he had ever understood anything. He rolled onto his knees, coughed once, and dragged himself upright. His ribs sang out with every movement. He walked back into the ring, on legs that felt like they belonged to a stranger. He also noticed, as he crossed the boundary line, that his body felt different, lighter. His steps were steadier than his ribs had any right to allow. His grip on his sword had settled into a form he had not been taught. It was as if some other person had left a set of instructions inside his muscles, and those instructions were slowly beginning to unfold on their own. Ian took his stance. He said, in a voice that came out steadier than he had expected, that it was his turn. Celia's mouth tightened. She invited him to try. Ian moved. He was faster than he had ever been in his life. His body understood distance in a way it had never understood before. He crossed the ring in 3 long strides and leapt into the air with a lightness that startled him, and for 1 bright and impossible second he watched himself descend on the school prodigy with a swordsman's control that did not belong to him. He knew, in that second, that something had happened during his missing week that had rewritten his body. Muscle memory did not appear from nowhere. Someone had trained this body for 7 days without permission, and the training had stayed even after the trainer had left. Celia read the attack, adjusted her guard, and dodged. She was still faster. She swept his sword aside with a small flick of her wrist, stepped inside his reach, and drove the pommel of her weapon into his stomach. Ian folded around it. He hit the ground on his knees for the 2nd time in as many minutes. The crowd made a small, disappointed sound, the sound of people who had been briefly interested and were now being asked to lose that interest. Celia looked down at him. She asked, with the flat and dangerous calm still in her voice, whether he had left the opening on purpose. She asked whether he thought she was going to fall for the same trick twice. Ian did not know what trick she was talking about. He said so. He said that if she brought up whatever it was 1 more time, he was going to go crazy. It was the wrong thing to say. Celia's face changed for the first time since she had walked into the arena. The flat calm cracked. Something hot and old moved underneath. She asked, in a much quieter voice, whose fault he thought it was that she had become the laughingstock of the entire academy. Then she leapt at him, and this time her aura ignited around her sword like a second blade of pale gold, and Ian understood that the fight had just moved into a place where his new body might not be enough. Ian raised his weapon in defense. He also raised, without meaning to, a small, silent hope that whichever version of himself had trained his muscles during the missing week had trained them well. Her sword came down at a diagonal that should have opened Ian from collarbone to hip. He did not know how he raised his blade in time. His body did the work before his mind caught up to it, and the shock of the impact traveled up his arm and rang inside his teeth. Celia did not stop. She twisted her wrist mid-strike, redirected the arc, and drove the pommel toward his temple. Ian ducked. He felt the wind of it pass through his hair. He countered on instinct, a rising cut that he had never practiced in his life, and Celia batted it aside with a movement so casual that it might as well have been a hand shooing away a fly. She came at him again, and again, and again. Every strike was a hair faster than the last. Ian read them, barely, with a vision that felt sharper than it had any right to feel. He noticed, in the small pockets of space between her attacks, that she was doing something odd. She was spending motion on flourishes that did not add anything to her strikes. She spun where she did not need to spin. She switched grips where a switch bought her nothing. She was fighting like a swordswoman who was trying to prove a point rather than end a fight. Ian did not have time to work out why. He was too busy staying alive. He blocked one strike with the flat of his blade, absorbed the impact into his shoulder, and let the momentum carry him half a step back. Celia followed him. Her aura flared brighter along the edge of her sword, and the pale gold light lifted the dust from the arena floor in slow, drifting spirals. She looked, in that moment, like something that had wandered into the school from a story that ended badly for everybody in it. Ian's throat was dry again. He tried to swallow past it and failed. She warned him, she said, without lowering her sword, that he should not charge in when he saw an opening. She said that every gap in her guard was a trap. She said that a real swordsman treated every offered gift as bait. Ian froze for a fraction of a second at the word trap, because those were not her words. Those were the words of a teacher, or the words of somebody older than her, and the way she spoke them had the flat weight of a quotation. Somebody had said those exact sentences to her before. Somebody had said them recently. Somebody had said them in a voice that had stayed with her long enough to become a lesson she now repeated at strangers. Ian understood, with a small, horrible drop in his stomach, that the somebody had been him. Or rather, the somebody had been the version of him that had walked around in his body for the last 7 days. The version that had put Celia in a hospital ward. The version that had told her, presumably while she was down, that her swordsmanship was full of unnecessary motion. And now she was throwing his own critique back into his face, over and over, because she had spent a week in that ward memorizing every word of it, and she wanted him to feel each one land. She struck at his hip, he blocked. She struck at his shoulder, he blocked. She struck at his throat, and he twisted his head sideways barely in time, and the flat of her blade grazed his ear hard enough to leave a hot line of pain behind. Ian stumbled back 3 paces. His heels touched the boundary of the ring. Celia paused, one breath away from him, and asked whether he was going to fight properly. She said that his current performance was worse than a joke. She said that if he was going to insult her by holding back, she was going to make him regret it in ways the healers would not be able to fix. Ian did not know how to explain to her that he was not holding back. He was fighting for his life, and his life was losing. He also did not know how to explain that the person she wanted to hurt was not standing in front of her. That person was gone. That person had walked out of Ian's body 7 days ago and had left Ian holding the bill for every insult, every threat, and every broken bone that had been handed out in his name. He did the only thing left to him. He fought. The duel entered a phase that Ian would later have trouble describing. His body moved without permission from his mind. He blocked strikes he should not have seen. He returned cuts he had never been taught. He noticed, in flickers between the pain, that Celia was reading his defense with growing frustration. Her flourishes grew wider. Her strikes grew heavier. She was overcommitting on every swing, because the version of him she remembered had punished restraint, and she was determined not to be caught being restrained a second time. Her form was becoming, of all things, worse. Not by much. Not enough for a spectator to notice. But enough for Ian, who was inside the fight, to feel the shift in her balance every time she loaded a strike. He began to match her pace. Barely. He was still losing every exchange by a small margin, But he was losing them more slowly than he had been. His arms had stopped screaming and had started simply aching. His breath had settled into a rhythm he could hold for another minute, maybe two. He thought, for a bright and dangerous moment, that if he could survive this exchange, he might actually reach the 10-minute mark on his own 2 feet. Then Celia pulled her sword back into a two-handed grip. She said, in the calm voice again, that he was finally fighting seriously. She said that she would now show him what she was truly capable of. She leapt at him with everything she had, and the pale gold aura around her blade brightened into a sheet of light that Ian's eyes did not want to look at directly. Ian watched her come. He did not raise his sword. He did not raise his axe. He simply watched. The sound of something breaking rang out across the arena. The sound that had rung out was not the sound of Ian's sword breaking. It was the sound of Celia's. Her aura had gathered too much force behind an attack that had needed less, and the blade had cracked in her hand at the exact moment Ian had chosen not to move. She stared at the fragment of steel in her fist, as if it had personally betrayed her. Ian, standing 2 paces away with both his weapons still lowered, understood in that same moment that the fight had shifted. She had overcommitted one time too many. Her body was ahead of her, her sword was behind her, and the small window she had left open was the only window Ian would ever get. He did not take it. Instead, he watched her. He noticed her stance, which was still perfect. He noticed her aura, which was still bright. He noticed the flicker in her eyes that told him she was already calculating how to finish him with the broken hilt she was still holding. And he noticed, underneath all of it, the way her shoulders had begun to shake. Not with fear, with something older than fear. Celia Yordina was not going to accept a draw. She was going to keep coming at him until one of them stopped breathing. Ian sighed a very small sigh. He walked forward. Celia raised the broken hilt anyway. She did not step back. She did not lower her hand. She stood there and prepared, with the calm of a person who had decided long ago that dying on her feet was better than losing on her knees, to receive whatever finishing strike he had chosen. Her eyes closed for a fraction of a second, and Ian saw, in that fraction, a much smaller and much younger version of the school prodigy, waiting for a blow she had already accepted. It hit him harder than any of her sword strikes had. He stopped a full arm's length in front of her, and raised his hand. He touched her forehead with his index finger. He said, quietly enough that only she could hear it, that the duel was over. He said that he was not going to hit her, and he was not going to finish her, and he was not going to give her the satisfaction of a wound she could carry into the next rematch. He said that if she wanted to be laughed at by the entire academy, she should keep fighting people who had already agreed not to fight her, and then he lowered his hand and stepped back. The arena was completely silent. Even the instructor did not seem to know how to call the match. Celia stared at him. Her eyes had gone very wide and very still. The broken hilt slipped a little in her fingers. She asked him, in a voice that had lost all of its dangerous flatness, whether he was mocking her. She asked whether this was worse than a defeat. She asked whether he understood what he had just done in front of 500 witnesses. Ian said that he understood. He said that winning was not the point. He said that other people's laughter did not turn a genius into a fool overnight, and that if a single duel was going to erase everything she had built with her sword, then she had never actually built anything at all. He said it the way a tired person said things they had figured out only in the last 10 seconds. He said it because he did not know how else to say it, and Celia, to Ian's complete surprise, lowered the broken hilt. She bowed to him. She said thank you. The crowd began to move again. The instructor announced Ian's victory with a note of confusion in his voice that he could not quite hide. Celine, from the edge of the field, made a sound that suggested she had bitten her own tongue in shock. Leto was already laughing, because Leto laughed at everything he did not understand. Ian walked out of the ring on legs that were shaking now that they were finally allowed to shake, and he decided, with a certainty that felt earned, that he would spend the rest of the term avoiding Celia Yordina as thoroughly as one human being could avoid another. That decision lasted exactly 4 days. On the morning of the 5th day, Ian noticed a girl following him. She was not particularly subtle about it. She hid behind trees that were narrower than her shoulders. She wore a mask that covered only the top half of her face, which meant that anyone who had ever seen her chin could identify her without difficulty. She trailed him from the dining hall to the classroom to the practice field and back again, and on every occasion she carried a small leather pouch clutched tightly against her chest. Celine saw her first. Celine threatened to fight her. Leto stepped between them and told Ian to go handle it before somebody died. Ian walked across the courtyard and asked Celia, whose mask was noticeably tilted, what she wanted. Celia stood up very straight and said, with the same directness she used for everything, that she wanted him to teach her. She wanted him to make her stronger before the hunting festival. She wanted him to accept the pouch, which contained a sum of gold that would have covered his tuition for a year, as payment for lessons she had not yet received. Ian refused the gold. He also refused the lessons. He explained, as gently as he could, that he was not stronger than her. He explained that he had won 2 duels by accident and by mercy, and that neither of those was a skill he could teach. He suggested she find Professor Derek instead. Celia listened to all of this with a small, stubborn frown, and then she asked, very quietly, whether he understood that she had nothing else. Her family had made it clear since she was 6 years old that she was worth exactly as much as the sword she carried. If she did not become the strongest student in her year, they would send her away the same way they had sent her mother away, and she would spend the rest of her life pretending she had never been born into the Yordina name at all. Ian felt the ground move a little beneath him at that. He had not asked for the story. He had not wanted it, but it had been given to him anyway, in the middle of an academy courtyard, by a girl who had until 4 days ago been the most feared duelist in the 2nd year. He did not know what to do with it. He agreed to train with her. He told himself that he was doing it only until the hunting festival. He told himself that once the festival was over, she would find her own way, and he would go back to being a name that instructors forgot. Celia bowed to him 3 separate times before he could walk away. Celine watched the entire exchange from behind a fountain with an expression that Ian would spend the next hour pretending he had not seen. The training began that afternoon. It did not go the way Ian had expected. Celia had, it turned out, no sense of when to rest. She had been raised on the principle that pain was a signal to keep working, and that healing potions were a tool for extending training sessions rather than ending them. Ian caught her, on the 2nd day, trying to drink her 3rd recovery vial in a single morning. He took the bottle out of her hand. He sat her down. He explained to her, in the flat voice of a person who was discovering he cared about something he had not signed up to care about, that potions closed wounds but did not repair the body underneath them. Fatigue was not a wound. Fatigue was the body telling its owner that the owner had spent more than the owner had earned. Celia listened to him with the same solemn attention she had brought to her sword forms. She asked him, after a long silence, why he was bothering to teach her these things. Ian said he did not know. He said that if she trained herself into a hospital bed before the festival, she would not make it to the starting line, and that would be a stupid way to lose a fight she had not yet fought. Celia looked at him for a while. Then she asked, in the same careful voice she had used for the confession about her mother, whether the 2 of them were friends now. Ian said yes before he had thought about it. He said yes the way people said yes when the honest answer had surprised them. Celia's eyes did something complicated behind her mask, and she did not speak again for the rest of the training session, and Ian walked back to his dormitory that evening with the distinct suspicion that his life had just become a great deal more complicated than he had planned. He was right, but not for the reason he expected, because when he opened his door that night, there was a new letter on his desk. It sat exactly where the first one had, the same paper, the same soft handwriting, the same seal, in the same red wax. Ian stared at it for a long moment from the doorway. Then he crossed the room, picked the letter up, and dropped it into the wastebasket without breaking the seal. He did not want to know what it said. He did not want a second prank to prove that the first one had not been a prank. He wanted to sleep, and he wanted to train Celia in the morning, and he wanted the 7 missing days on his calendar to stay missing. He slept badly. The next morning he went to visit Emma. Emma was a red-haired girl in the alchemy department who had known Ian since their 1st year. She was rude to him in the exact same way she was rude to everybody, which meant Ian trusted her more than he trusted most people. He had gone to ask her a question about the letters. He had not planned to phrase the question directly, and he had not planned to admit that he was worried, and he had done both of those things within the first 3 minutes of the conversation. Emma told him a very long story about the creation of the world. She told him about the celestial god Ars, who had been born from light. She told him about the evil god Amalos, who had been born from darkness. She told him about the law of time, which the celestial god had woven into the foundation of everything, and about the restriction that only a servant called Delhilm had the power to challenge that law. Ian listened to all of it. Ian understood none of it. He said so. Emma sighed. She said, more simply, that no ordinary being could send information backward through time. She said that if such a thing had happened, it had required either the intervention of a mythological creature whose existence had never been proven, or the collapse of a large enough portion of reality to bend the celestial god's law temporarily out of shape. She said that both options were absurd. She told him to leave. She also gave him, on the way out, a small vial of a new potion she had been developing. It concealed the drinker's presence. It did not make them invisible. It only erased the pressure of their existence from the space they occupied. Ian drank the vial before he was out of her doorway. He did it partly to test it and partly to annoy her. Emma slapped his shoulder without looking, from 6 paces away, and told him that he still smelled like a person even when he did not feel like one. That was the moment Ian understood, with a small chill, that the potion was going to be much more useful in a forest than in a classroom. He asked her, on his way out, not to go into the southern forest alone during the hunting festival. He told her that the monsters were behaving oddly. She promised she would send for him if she needed to gather materials in that area. Ian said good. Then he walked back to his dormitory, told himself that he had done the responsible thing, and forgot the conversation by the time he reached his own door. That night, when he opened his room, there was a 3rd letter waiting on his desk. He threw that one away too. He did not sleep at all. The news arrived just after dawn. Leto came to his door. Leto's face was the wrong color. He said that Emma had been found in the southern forest. He said that a monster had opened her from shoulder to hip. He said that she had survived only because she had used one of her own potions to mimic death, and that the potion had run out before the search party had arrived, and that she was now in the Academy Cathedral in a state that the saints could not yet name. Ian did not move for a very long time. He heard Leto's words the way a person heard rain against a window during a fever. Then he pushed past Leto without a word and ran the whole distance to the cathedral, and he arrived to find Emma already laid on a stretcher, with her father kneeling beside her, and the saint of the academy standing over her, with both palms glowing pale gold. The saint told him what the potion had cost her. She told him what would be required to bring Emma back. She said that a miracle of that scale needed an offering of high divine or magical value, and that Emma's family did not have anything of the kind, and that he should prepare himself for the possibility that his friend was not going to wake up. Ian did not remember the walk out of the cathedral. He remembered the walk back to his dormitory. He remembered opening his door. He remembered walking to the wastebasket. He remembered lifting the first letter out with fingers that had gone completely numb, and unfolding it, and reading it all the way through this time, and finding on the second page a single line that named Emma, and named the forest, and named the hour. He sat on the floor of his dormitory for a long time after that. He did not cry. Crying would have required a level of emotional coordination he did not currently possess. He simply sat there, holding the letter in both hands, and understood with a slow, awful clarity that everything he had thrown into the wastebasket over the last week had been a warning he could have used. He read the second letter next, then the third. The third one mentioned the hunting festival by name. It listed a magical beast he had never heard of, and a specific area of the southern forest where the beast could be found, and the name of a student who would be attacked if nothing was done to stop it. Ian stared at that name for a long moment. It was not Emma's. Emma had already been listed in the first letter, and the first letter had been correct. This new name belonged to a girl in the 4th year, someone Ian had never spoken to, and yet somehow the letter knew that she would be in that stretch of forest at that hour on that specific day of the festival. Ian stood up. His knees felt distant. His hands felt closer to him than they had any right to be. He folded all 3 letters and placed them carefully inside his coat, over his ribs, where the paper would rest against his heartbeat. He said, out loud to nobody, that he was going to find out who was writing to him. He said that if the writer wanted his attention, the writer now had it, and he said, with a small dark thread of anger running through the words, that if the writer had known about Emma before Emma had been hurt, then the writer had also known when to send the letter, and had chosen to send it too late for Ian to act. Somebody was playing a very careful game with him. Ian was going to find that somebody, and then Ian was going to decide, very slowly, what to do about them. The letters were signed with a single name, Sepia. It was a flower. It grew in the north. It grew, specifically, in the mountain provinces that belonged to the Yordina family. Ian did not know very many people from that region. He knew exactly one. He walked out of his dormitory before he had thought the plan through. Leto tried to stop him in the corridor and asked where he was going. Ian did not answer. He walked across the courtyard, past the practice field, past the training arena, all the way to the small clearing beyond the eastern wall where Celia had begun to practice her family's secret sword forms in the hour before dawn. He found her there, as he had known he would. She was drawing 3 luminous traces of a golden blade against the morning air, one after another, and the shape of the technique was the shape of a lion's paw closing on prey. Ian watched her for a full minute before she noticed him. Then Celia lowered her sword, and she smiled at him, the small, careful smile she reserved for him alone. And Ian felt the last piece of a puzzle he had not known he was building click quietly into place. He was going to have to find out whether Celia Yordina was the person writing him letters from a future that had not yet happened, and he was going to have to do it without letting her see him look. But before Ian could reach Celia's clearing, he stopped at the eastern gate and turned back. He had to be smarter than his own anger. He could not accuse a Yordina of anything, least of all a Yordina who had, 4 days ago, become the closest thing he had to a new friend, without evidence he could actually hold in his hand. He needed help. He needed a person who knew every gossip channel in the academy, and who owed Ian enough favors to open those channels quietly. He needed Leto. Leto was in the second-year lounge, drinking tea that he had almost certainly stolen from the instructor's pantry. He looked up when Ian dropped into the chair across from him and said, without preamble, that he needed to find someone named Sepia. Leto choked on the tea. He asked whether Ian had gotten himself a girlfriend or a scam. Ian told him that it was neither, and that he could not explain further, and that Leto should not laugh at the name because the person carrying it was writing letters that were coming true. Leto laughed anyway, briefly, and then stopped when he saw Ian's face. He set his cup down. He asked what Ian actually knew. Ian told him what he could. He said that sepia was a name signed at the bottom of letters he had been receiving. He said that the letters had predicted Emma's attack down to the hour. He said that they had come from an address he could not place, in handwriting that suggested a woman with northern training. He did not mention the date at the bottom of the first letter, and he did not mention the missing 7 days, because neither of those things would help Leto find a suspect. Leto listened to all of it with the small, unfocused expression he wore when he was actually paying attention. Then he said that sepia was a flower. Ian said he knew. Leto said that the flower only grew in 3 provinces, and that all 3 of those provinces sat inside the borders of a single family's territory. Ian said he knew that too. Leto looked at him for a long moment, and Ian saw the shape of the conclusion form behind his friend's eyes, and Leto said the name Yordina softly, as if saying it too loudly might make it truer than it needed to be. Ian did not confirm the guess. He did not deny it either. He asked Leto to look into the 4th-year girl named in the 3rd letter. He asked Leto to find out whether she had a habit of walking in the southern forest. He asked Leto to be careful, and not to mention Ian's name to anyone, and to bring him whatever he found within 3 days. Leto agreed. He also said, in the same careful voice he had used for the name Yordina, that whoever Sepia was, she was almost certainly not writing these letters as a prank, and that Ian should stop pretending she might be. Ian nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. He walked out of the lounge and back across the courtyard, and he arrived at the eastern clearing 3 minutes later, with his head no clearer than it had been when he left it. That was when he found Celia. That was when the small, careful smile happened. That was when the piece clicked into place. And that was when Ian realized that the smart move, the only move, was to keep training her. Because if Celia was sepia, the training was going to give him access to her every day. And if Celia was not sepia, the training was still going to give him a partner in the hunting festival who could carry the group past whatever the 3rd letter had described. He walked into the clearing. He picked up his sword. He asked her, as casually as he could manage, whether she had ever heard of a flower called sepia. Celia's smile widened. She said that her mother used to grow them. Ian did not let his face change at the answer. He asked, in the same casual voice, whether the flower grew anywhere else. Celia said no, not really. She said that a few gardeners in the capital had tried to cultivate it, but that the plant refused to bloom outside the northern soil, and that anyone in the southern academies who claimed to keep a sepia in a window box was almost certainly lying about it. She said all of this while she oiled the edge of a practice blade, without ever looking up, without once suspecting that Ian was measuring every syllable against the letters folded inside his coat. Ian nodded. He asked whether her mother had loved the flower especially. Celia paused with the cloth halfway down the blade. She said that her mother had loved it more than anything else in the northern gardens. She said that her mother had been named for it once, informally, by a servant who had watched her tend the flower beds in her childhood. And she said, in a smaller voice, that after her mother had been sent away from the family, no one in the household had been allowed to plant sepia in the estate gardens again. Ian filed the information away. He asked no further questions. He raised his sword. He suggested that they resume the training session where they had left off. Celia rose in one clean motion, took her stance, and smiled at him, the small, careful smile that had become the most complicated thing in his life. Ian smiled back. And somewhere underneath the smile, in a small locked room at the back of his mind, he began to plan very carefully how he was going to spend the next 3 weeks watching every move a girl named Celia Yordina made. The hunting festival was in 20 days. Whatever Sepia was going to do, she was going to do it there. Ian was going to be waiting. The 20 days between that conversation and the hunting festival passed faster than Ian had wanted them to. He spent every morning training Celia. He spent every afternoon reading and rereading the 3 letters he had already received, hunting for details he had missed the first 4 times through. He spent every evening at the cathedral, sitting beside Emma's bed, watching her chest rise and fall under the light of the saint's slow healing spells, saying nothing to her because there was nothing left to say. And he spent every night in his own dormitory, waiting for the sound that never came. No new letter arrived on his desk. Whoever Sepia was, she had gone quiet after the 3rd message. Ian did not know whether that silence meant she had run out of warnings, or whether it meant the next warning was going to arrive too close to the event to leave him any time to act. He decided he could not wait. He had to prepare for the festival on his own information. The 3rd letter had mentioned a specific magical beast, and it had described the beast's location, and it had described in careful, almost tender detail, the friend of Emma's who was going to be attacked if Ian did not intervene. He knew the beast's approximate size, he knew its general behavior, and he knew, from the way the letter had described its movement, that fighting it alone was not going to work. He needed a team. He needed a team that was strong enough to bring the beast down, and small enough that 4 students could hunt together without drawing the wrong kind of attention, and balanced enough that they did not fall apart on the first day of the festival. The obvious first pick was Celia. She had already agreed to enter the festival with him. That was 1 slot filled. The second obvious pick was Celine, because Celine came from a family of professional hunters, and because she read the movement of animals through underbrush the way most students read a textbook. The 3rd slot Ian had spent 5 entire days trying to fill from a distance, and had gotten nowhere, and had finally accepted that the person who needed to fill it was the same person he least wanted to speak to. Elsie Rhinella, 4th year, top of her magic division. Rich, arrogant, and currently holding a personal grudge against him for the fight in which he had broken her family shield in front of witnesses. Ian did not enjoy the conversation. He did not enjoy walking into the warehouse district behind the academy and finding Elsie in the middle of beating a first-year student who had made the mistake of laughing at her defeat. He did not enjoy the way her face went pale when she recognized him, or the way she stopped mid-strike and stood very still and waited for him to explain what he wanted, or the small, ugly smile he had to force onto his own face while he said, in the softest voice he had ever used on another human being, that he wanted her to join his team. He asked her whether she was going to keep watching Delphine Yordina win the hunting festival for a 4th year in a row, or whether she was going to help him take that victory away from the family she hated most. Elsie stared at him for a long moment. Then she said yes. Then she said more quietly that she would enjoy watching the older Yordina lose to her own younger sister's team more than she had enjoyed anything else in 3 years. Ian nodded. He walked out without patting her on the head this time, because he did not want to push his luck. That left Celine. Celine was not a difficult recruit. Celine was, in fact, waiting for Ian to ask. She had watched him invite Celia into training. She had watched him spend 20 afternoons in the eastern clearing with a girl who was not her. She had watched Celia bow to him and smile at him, and follow him halfway across the academy grounds. And she had been quietly, steadily furious about all of it, in a way she had not allowed him to see. When Ian sat down on the bench beside her and said that he wanted her to be the 4th member of his festival team, Celine said yes before he had finished the sentence. Then she said, in a voice that had none of the softness her yes had carried, that he needed to understand something first. He needed to understand that she was not doing this for Celia. She was not doing this for Elsie. She was not doing this for the reward money, or the ranking points, or the glory of standing on the winner's stage at the end of the event. She was doing it because he was doing it, and because she had been by his side since they were both 6 years old, and because if he was going to walk into a forest at the exact hour a magical beast was scheduled to appear, then she was going to be walking 2 paces behind him with an arrow already nocked. Ian did not know what to say to that. Celine did not seem to require an answer. She stood up, brushed her uniform straight, and walked away before he could find one. Ian carried the conversation with him for the rest of the afternoon. He did not know what to do with it. He did not know what to do with the specific way she had said the words by his side. He also did not know what to do with the way Leto, who had watched the whole exchange from 30 paces away with the appearance of a man who had suddenly found the most interesting cloud in the sky, was now looking at him with a small pitying smile. Leto walked over after Celine had gone. He put a hand on Ian's shoulder. He said, in the flat voice of a man delivering bad news, that his best friend was walking straight into a problem he had not noticed yet, and that the problem's name was Celine, and that Ian was going to have to solve it before it solved him. Ian said he had no idea what Leto was talking about. Leto said that was exactly the problem. The team began training together the following morning. It did not go well. Celine refused to make eye contact with Celia. Celia refused to acknowledge Celine's presence in the field. Elsie refused to acknowledge either of them, because Elsie considered both second-year students to be beneath the notice of a fourth-year top student, and only came to the training sessions at all because Ian had reminded her, once, in a voice that had a small axe hidden inside it, that she had agreed to be there. Ian stood at the center of the practice field and watched the 4 of them fail to form a triangle around him for the 3rd time in a row, and he understood with a slow, cold clarity that the tactical problem was not the magical beast at all. The tactical problem was that his own team was going to fall apart on the first day of the festival, and if it did, they were all going to die in a forest. He asked Professor Derek for help. He did not tell Derek why he needed it. Derek did not ask. Derek simply announced, on the morning of the 5th training session, that the 4 of them were going to hunt him through the eastern woods for 2 hours, and that the exercise would end when they either found him or gave up. Then Derek vanished. Elsie loudly announced that this was going to be easy. Elsie was wrong. Derek destroyed them. He did it slowly, with the patience of a man who had spent 20 years watching students overestimate themselves. He caught Celia in a solo charge and dropped her with a single strike to the base of her neck. He caught Elsie in a moment of unshielded arrogance and put a fist through her staff. He caught Celine distracted by an argument with Celia that Celia had not agreed to have, and knocked her flat with a sweep that came out of a bush she had not noticed. And when it was over, and the 4 of them were sitting on the forest floor covered in dirt and dust and their own bruised pride, Derek stood over them and said, in a voice that did not raise once, that magical beasts did not wait for their prey to finish arguing. Then he walked away. Ian did not train them again that day. Ian did not know how. Celine fixed the problem herself. It happened at 10:30 at night, in the eastern forest, at a location Ian had picked, because it was far from any dormitory window. He had written her a note. He had left the note on the floor outside her door. He had asked her to meet him alone, and when she arrived, and looked at him with an expression that was half hope and half something Ian did not want to name, he threw a sword at her feet and told her that they were going to settle her rivalry with Celia the same way they had settled every fight they had ever had. Fists, if she preferred, swords, if she wanted to make it hurt. Whoever surrendered first would have to accept the outcome and stop fighting inside the team. Celine picked up the sword. She did not ask why he had chosen this method. She did not ask why he had picked her instead of asking Celia to back down. She only asked what the victory condition was. Ian said the first one to yield lost. Celine took her stance. Ian took his. And the 2 of them, who had dueled each other with sticks in the courtyard of their shared hometown when they were both 8 years old, began to duel for real for the first time in their lives. Celine was stronger than Ian had thought she would be. She had been training in a technique Ian had not seen her use before. She threw her weight into every swing, held nothing back, and detonated small explosions of hunter's magic under each of his footholds until the ground itself became her ally. Ian took the first exchange badly. He took the second exchange worse. On the third exchange, he understood that she was not going to let him win by patience. She was going to bury him with everything she had, because she wanted to, because she needed to. Because if he beat her, she would accept whatever he told her to accept afterward, and if he could not beat her, then whatever she had been holding back for 4 days on that practice field was going to keep leaking out into every training session between now and the festival. Ian threw his sword, he threw his axe. He drew his sword back out of the air with the tricks his imposter had left inside his muscles, and he ended the duel by using his own arm as a shield to stop Celine's finishing strike, letting her blade sink into the meat of his forearm rather than into his chest, and pinning her wrist against his ribs while his own sword rested 1 careful inch from her collarbone. Celine stared at him, her eyes filled with tears she did not let fall. She said his name once, quietly. Ian said hers back, more quietly still. He asked her to apologize to Celia in the morning. He asked her to do her best in the festival. He said that was what he wanted her to accept. He did not remember the rest of the walk back to the academy. He passed out somewhere along the path. He woke up in the infirmary the next morning with his arm bandaged and Celine sleeping in the chair beside his bed, and Celia standing in the doorway with a bag of Ian's favorite bread rolls, and the two of them exchanging a look that was almost, but not quite, friendship. That was enough, Celine apologized. Celia accepted. The team held. The festival began 3 days later. Emperor Attalus himself opened the ceremony. Ian was not close enough to see him clearly, but he was close enough to hear the announcement that echoed across the parade ground. 500 students, 1 southern forest, 8 hours to hunt the strongest magical creature they could find. The team that brought back the most impressive kill would win the festival, and receive a reward, and be remembered by the Academy for the rest of the year. The horn sounded, the gates opened, and Ian's team walked into the tree line together for the first time as an actual team. The forest was too quiet. Celine noticed it before anyone else did. She stopped after the first 100 paces and held up her hand. She said that the animals were hiding. She said that when animals hid at this hour, in this weather, it meant that a predator was already inside the forest and was already close enough for the smaller creatures to feel it. Elsie sensed the magical signature next. She pointed north. She said that whatever was ahead of them was radiating enough unrefined magic to bend the compass in her staff, and that it was almost certainly the highest-ranked beast in the entire festival zone. Ian's stomach tightened. The letter had described exactly this. The letter had also described the clearing they were about to enter, and the corpses they were about to find in it, and the creature that was going to be standing in the middle of those corpses when they arrived. They stepped into the clearing. The corpses were exactly where the letter had said they would be. 20, maybe 30 smaller magical beasts, torn apart with the same careful pattern of wounds. Not eaten, not scattered. Displayed. Whatever had killed them had done it slowly, and had left them arranged for someone to find. Celia noted the arrangement in a whisper. Ian nodded. He did not tell her that he had read about this specific clearing in a letter 3 weeks earlier. The beast was in the center of the display. It was the size of a small wagon. Its fur was gray, its eyes were black, and the horn on its forehead was as long as Ian's forearm. It was down on all fours when they arrived, and it lifted its head slowly as it noticed them, and Ian saw the moment its attention shifted from its own kills to the 4 humans who had walked into its territory. The air around its snout crackled with a pale blue light that Ian recognized from the letter's description. Lightning. It could throw lightning. That was the detail the 3rd letter had put in the exact center of the page, underlined twice, in a hand that had trembled slightly on the 2nd underline. Ian gave the order. Elsie raised her staff and cast the shield formation they had drilled in Derek's field. Celine faded into the tree line to Ian's left. Celia moved to his right with her sword drawn, her aura already ignited into pale gold. Ian himself walked forward, alone, into the center of the clearing, because the beast had decided he was the leader, and he did not want to correct it. He told the team that its weakness was the horn. He did not explain how he knew. Elsie did not ask. Elsie only nodded and adjusted her spell targeting to match. The beast charged. The next 10 minutes were the longest 10 minutes of Ian's life. The wolf, if it could be called a wolf, was faster than anything the training sessions had prepared them for. It did not run through the forest so much as bend the forest around itself, twisting its own body into angles that no living creature was meant to hold. Celia's opening strike caught only air. Celine's arrow bounced off a shoulder that should not have been where it was. Elsie's first spell missed entirely, because the beast had not been where Elsie had aimed by the time the spell arrived. Ian took a claw across his side that should have killed him, and only stayed on his feet because Elsie threw a second shield around him at the exact moment the claw made contact. They regrouped. They tried again. The beast opened its mouth, and a ball of pale lightning formed inside it, and Ian shouted at Elsie to run half a second before the bolt released. The blast tore a trench across the clearing. Celia pushed Elsie sideways at the last possible instant. Celine reappeared out of the trees and drew the beast's attention with a shot to its eye that grazed the eyelid but did not blind it, and Ian, running low on options and lower on time, remembered the exact wording of the letter. The beast had a lightning cooldown. It could not fire the bolt twice in a row. It needed at least 20 seconds between uses. If the team could bait one bolt, they had 20 seconds to end the fight. Ian baited it himself. He walked toward the beast alone, without shield, without cover, and it opened its mouth again, and he heard Celia scream his name in the distance, and the bolt released. Ian dived. The bolt clipped his shoulder and buried itself in a tree behind him, and the tree exploded, and Ian rolled up onto his knees with his ears ringing and his coat smoking and enough time on the clock to end the fight. He shouted for Elsie's magic. He shouted for Celia to hold the beast's head. He shouted for Celine to draw its second eye. And when Celia leapt into the air and caught the wolf's face with her sword and forced its snout upward, and when Celine put an arrow through its second eye at exactly the right angle to make it flinch, Ian was already running with his own sword drawn, and he drove the blade all the way through the beast's palate at the exact moment Elsie's spell hit the horn. The horn shattered. The beast collapsed. The clearing went silent. Ian dropped to his knees beside the corpse and did not stand up for a long time. Celia knelt beside him. Celine reappeared from the trees and stood over both of them with a small, quiet smile. Elsie lowered her staff. And somewhere far behind them, in the middle of another part of the forest, the older sister of Celia, Yordina, was waiting with her own team, and she was going to be very unhappy when she learned who had made the first legendary kill of the festival. But Ian did not know that yet. Ian only knew that Emma was going to be saved. The beast's body was going to be enough for the offering. The saint had promised it, and the beast was here, and Emma was going to open her eyes again. Ian let himself smile, just for a moment, before he stood up and looked at the tree line beyond the clearing and understood that the second half of the letter had not yet come true. The second half had described an ambush, right here, right after the kill. From 4 people the letter had listed by name. Ian drew his sword back out of the wolf's palate. He said quietly that the fight was not over yet, and he turned to face the shadows at the edge of the clearing, where 4 silhouettes had just stepped out from between the trees. The first silhouette that resolved into a full figure was Delphine Yordina. She walked into the clearing the way a person walked into a room she already owned. Her sword was still sheathed. Her hair was still braided back into the ceremonial knot her family used for formal events. And her eyes moved past Ian and past Celine and past Elsie and locked directly onto the younger sister who had, until this moment, been kneeling beside a magical beast that Delphine had almost certainly come here to kill herself. Ian saw the muscles in Celia's shoulders tighten. He saw the small, quick flinch that traveled up her spine, and he understood, with a sudden clarity, that the ambush the letter had described was not really about the wolf, it was about Celia. Behind Delphine came 3 others, a blue-haired mage with an ice staff, a tall boy with twin axes who Ian had met once, briefly, at the festival gates, a quieter man who carried no visible weapon at all, and who Ian's instincts marked immediately as the most dangerous of the 4. The letter had listed all of them by name, but Ian did not need the letter anymore. He could read them off their stances. He could read them off the way they had arranged themselves in a loose crescent around the clearing, cutting off 2 of the 3 possible escape routes without appearing to have moved into position at all. Delphine spoke first. She said, with a small smile that did not touch her eyes, that it was a shame the beast had already been killed. She said that a corpse of that quality, brought back to the festival grounds by the correct team, would have been enough to secure the winner's place for the 4th year in a row. She said that unfortunately, Ian's team was not going to be the correct team. She said that a rearrangement of ownership was going to be necessary. And she said, without ever raising her voice above a conversational tone, that Celia was going to step away from the corpse now and let her elder sister take what her elder sister had come to collect. Celia did not move. Ian watched the moment stretch. He watched Celia's hand tighten on the hilt of her sword. He watched Delphine's smile go one shade thinner, and he stepped, quite deliberately, between them. He said, in the same conversational tone, that the corpse was not going anywhere. He said that his team had earned it, and his team was going to bring it back, and Delphine could either fight for it or walk away. He said it politely. He said it while his own hand was resting on the axe at his hip, and he said it while every one of the 3 fighters behind Delphine was already shifting their weight into the stances that meant an attack was 90 seconds away at the outside. Delphine looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his hand on the axe. She looked at the wolf behind him, and at Celia beside him, and at Elsie and Celine arranged around him in the loose formation the 4 of them had never actually practiced, but had somehow fallen into by instinct. And she said, in a voice that Ian would remember for a long time afterward, that she had not come here expecting to fight a boy. She had come here expecting to correct a younger sister. She said that if a boy insisted on getting in her way, she would treat him the way she treated any obstacle that failed to move when it was told to. She drew her sword. The clearing went very still. Ian could hear the wind moving through the trees behind him. He could hear his own heartbeat inside his ears. He could hear Elsie whisper the first syllable of a shield spell that she had not yet finished casting. And he could hear, underneath all of it, the small, careful voice of the letter he had folded inside his coat 3 weeks ago, telling him that this was the moment when everything he had prepared for was either going to work or was not going to work. Ian raised his sword. He said, very quietly, that Delphine should not have come here alone with only 3 people. He said that his letter had been very specific about the number. Delphine's smile disappeared entirely. She asked him, in a voice that had gone flat, what he had just said. Ian did not answer. He charged. The first silhouette that resolved into a full figure was Delphine Yordina. She walked into the clearing the way a person walked into a room she already owned. Her sword was still sheathed. Her hair was still braided back into the ceremonial knot her family used for formal events. And her eyes moved past Ian and past Celine and past Elsie and locked directly onto the younger sister who had, until this moment, been kneeling beside a magical beast that Delphine had almost certainly come here to kill herself. Ian saw the muscles in Celia's shoulders tighten. He saw the small, quick flinch that traveled up her spine, and he understood, with a sudden clarity, that the ambush the letter had described was not really about the wolf. It was about Celia. Behind Delphine came 3 others. A blue-haired mage with an ice staff. A tall boy with twin axes who Ian had met once, briefly, at the festival gates. A quieter man who carried no visible weapon at all, and who Ian's instincts marked immediately as the most dangerous of the 4. The letter had listed all of them by name, but Ian did not need the letter anymore. He could read them off their stances. He could read them off the way they had arranged themselves in a loose crescent around the clearing, cutting off 2 of the 3 possible escape routes without appearing to have moved into position at all. Delphine spoke first. She said, with a small smile that did not touch her eyes, that it was a shame the beast had already been killed. She said that a corpse of that quality, brought back to the festival grounds by the correct team, would have been enough to secure the winner's place for the 4th year in a row. She said that unfortunately, Ian's team was not going to be the correct team. She said that a rearrangement of ownership was going to be necessary. And she said, without ever raising her voice above a conversational tone, that Celia was going to step away from the corpse now and let her elder sister take what her elder sister had come to collect. Celia did not move. Ian watched the moment stretch. He watched Celia's hand tighten on the hilt of her sword. He watched Delphine's smile go one shade thinner, and he stepped, quite deliberately, between them. He said, in the same conversational tone, that the corpse was not going anywhere. He said that his team had earned it, and his team was going to bring it back, and Delphine could either fight for it or walk away. He said it politely. He said it while his own hand was resting on the axe at his hip, and he said it while every one of the 3 fighters behind Delphine was already shifting their weight into the stances that meant an attack was 90 seconds away at the outside. Delphine looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his hand on the axe. She looked at the wolf behind him, and at Celia beside him, and at Elsie and Celine arranged around him in the loose formation the 4 of them had never actually practiced but had somehow fallen into by instinct. And she said, in a voice that Ian would remember for a long time afterward, that she had not come here expecting to fight a boy. She had come here expecting to correct a younger sister. She said that if a boy insisted on getting in her way, she would treat him the way she treated any obstacle that failed to move when it was told to. She drew her sword. The clearing went very still. Ian could hear the wind moving through the trees behind him. He could hear his own heartbeat inside his ears, and he could hear, underneath all of it, the small, careful voice of the letter he had folded inside his coat 3 weeks ago, telling him that this was the moment when everything he had prepared for was either going to work or was not going to work. The ambush began the way the letter had said it would. The twin-axe fighter went for Celine, because Celine was the smallest, and because attackers who did not know Celine assumed that small meant weak. He learned within 2 seconds that this assumption was wrong. Celine ducked under his first swing, drove her hunter's knife into the meat behind his knee, and rolled clear before his second axe had finished the arc. He hit the ground with a shout of pure outrage. Celine was already 3 paces away by the time he touched dirt. The ice mage went for Elsie, because a mage always went for the enemy mage first. Elsie was ready. She had been ready since Delphine had drawn her sword, and possibly since Delphine had walked into the clearing, and possibly since the day 3 weeks earlier when Ian had first put an axe on the table between them and offered her a way to hurt the family she hated most. Her first spell was already in the air before the ice mage had finished raising her staff. The 2 spells met in the space between them. There was a small, hard sound, like a plate breaking inside a cabinet. Then the ice mage was on her back with her staff shattered, and Elsie was walking forward through the settling frost with the small, cold smile of a 4th-year student who had finally been allowed to fight seriously for the first time in her academy career. The quiet man with no visible weapon went for Ian. Ian had been expecting that. He had also been dreading it, because he could not read the man's fighting style off the man's stance, and because a fighter who did not carry a visible weapon was almost always either useless or catastrophically dangerous. This one was not useless. Ian understood that in the first exchange. The man moved in a way that reminded Ian of nothing he had trained against. He did not step. He arrived. One instant he was 10 paces away, and the next instant he was inside Ian's guard with 2 fingers pressed against the hollow of Ian's throat, and Ian's own axe was hanging from a hand Ian could not quite feel. Ian pulled backward on pure instinct. He got a step of clearance. The man came with him. Ian threw his sword directly at the man's chest, because when he could not outfight an opponent, he had learned to make the opponent worry about something small and irritating instead. The sword did not hit. The man batted it aside without appearing to move his arm. But he did stop, for the smallest possible fraction of a second, and in that fraction, Ian pulled the dagger out from where he had hidden it against his ribs 3 weeks earlier, and drove the point of it into the seam of the man's shoulder. The dagger had been a gift. Delphine Yordina had given it to Ian herself, in a room at the top of a dormitory tower, on a night Ian did not want to think about too clearly. She had told him at the time that she had put a tracking spell on the blade. Ian had not thrown the dagger away. He had kept it, and now, with the point of it buried in the shoulder of Delphine's most dangerous subordinate, Ian shouted across the clearing that Delphine's own tracking spell was still active, and that anything the spell touched was now something Delphine's magic was going to react to. Delphine froze in the middle of her own charge. Ian saw the calculation move across her face. She had to decide whether he was bluffing, and she had to decide quickly, and she did not have the information she needed to decide. If he was lying, she could ignore him and keep coming. If he was telling the truth, her tracking spell was going to feed her the pain signals from her own subordinate's shoulder, and any counterstrike she launched against Ian would find its way back through the spell's binding into her own body first. It was a lie, of course. Delphine's tracking spell did not work that way, and Ian had known it did not work that way since Leto had explained the mechanics to him a week and a half ago, but Delphine did not know that Ian knew. Delphine only knew that she had told him about the spell in a private conversation, and that he was now referencing it with a specificity that suggested he had researched it, and that he was 90% likely to be correct. She hesitated. Ian moved. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides. He did not draw his sword back out of the man's shoulder. He drew his axe instead, and he brought it around in the wide horizontal arc that his impostor had drilled into his muscles during the missing week, and Delphine raised her own sword to block it just barely in time. The blades met. The force of the impact traveled up Ian's arm and rattled his teeth for the second time that day, but Delphine's feet slid backward through the grass, and her balance broke by a fraction, and Ian saw the opening he had been waiting for. He did not take it with his weapon. He took it with his voice. He said, very quietly, that Delphine did not want to fight him in front of witnesses. He said that if she killed him here, she was going to have to explain the corpse to the festival judges, and the corpse of a low-ranking noble killed in a hunting festival was going to raise questions her family did not want raised. He said that if she failed to kill him here, she was going to lose the corpse of the beast to a team led by her own younger sister, and the story of that loss was going to travel back to the northern estate faster than she could travel there herself. He said that either outcome was worse for her than the outcome he was about to offer. And he offered her the outcome. He said she could walk away right now, with all 4 of her team members intact, and he would not report what had happened in this clearing to anyone in the academy. He would tell the judges the wolf had died in a solo hunt. He would let her save face. In exchange, she would apologize to Celia, in front of him, in words he chose, and she would agree to leave her younger sister alone for the rest of the academic year. Delphine stared at him. The paws stretched. Behind her, the twin axe fighter was still on the ground clutching his knee. The ice mage was still on her back. The quiet man was still standing very still, with a dagger in his shoulder that his tracking magic could not remove. And in front of her, Ian was still holding his axe against her sword, and Celia was still watching with an expression Delphine had never seen on her sister's face before. The apology came out through Delphine's teeth. She said the words. Ian made her say them twice, because she said them too quietly the first time, and because he had decided that whatever else this day was, it was going to be the day Celia Yordina heard her elder sister apologize to her in public. Celia did not respond. Celia only stood there and let the words fall against her, one at a time, and Ian watched the color come back into his friend's face for the first time in an hour. Delphine turned. She collected her team. She walked out of the clearing without another word, and she did not look back once. And Ian understood as he watched her disappear into the trees that he had just made a permanent enemy of the future head of the Yordina family. He also understood that he did not care. She had already been his enemy. This had only formalized the arrangement. The rest of the festival was easier than the rest of the festival had any right to be. The wolf's body was hauled back to the parade ground by a team of academy porters, and the announcer's voice went hoarse describing it, and the reward was announced in a tone that suggested the announcer did not entirely believe the numbers he had been given. A bottle of dragon blood, split 4 ways. Enough gold to buy every member of the team a small estate in the countryside. Enough ranking points to push all 4 of them into the top 10 of their respective years. And, more importantly to Ian than any of the rest of it, the wolf's body itself, which the saint accepted as an offering on the spot, and which she promised would be enough to bring Emma back within the week. Emma woke up 3 days later. Ian was in the chair beside her bed when it happened. She opened her eyes, looked at him, and said, in a voice hoarse from disuse, that he had a lot of nerve making her wait this long. She then told him that she had made him a new potion, and that it was in her workshop, and that he had better come pick it up before the end of the month, because she was not going to keep it warm for him. Ian laughed. He did not remember the last time he had laughed like that. He walked out of the cathedral into the late afternoon sun, and he thought, with a small and unfamiliar warmth, that maybe the letters had actually been worth something. The academy threw the winning team a celebration party. Ian was not much for parties. He drank enough to be polite, sat through enough speeches to be respectful, and slipped out through a side door at the earliest opportunity he could manage without offending the emperor's cousin. Celia found him in the garden behind the ballroom. She was not wearing her mask this time. She was holding something small in one hand. She did not know how to make the speech she had been practicing. Ian could see her trying. She started once, stopped, started again, and then finally just held out her hand and showed him what she was carrying. It was a necklace. The pendant was shaped like a small flower, cast in some pale silver alloy Ian did not recognize, and it caught the moonlight in a way that made the petals look almost alive. She said, without meeting his eyes, that the flower was a sepia. She said that her mother used to keep one in a small silver frame beside her mirror. She said that she had commissioned the pendant from a jeweler in the capital, and that she had originally planned to keep it for herself, and that she had changed her mind 3 days ago after watching him fight her sister in a clearing full of blood. She said, very quietly, that she wanted him to have it. Ian did not know what to say. He took the necklace. He looked at the flower in his palm. He looked at Celia. He thought, for one long complicated moment, about the letters folded inside his coat, and about the name at the bottom of them, and about the way that name and this flower now meant exactly the same thing. He asked her, in a voice that he tried very hard to keep casual, whether she had ever sent him a letter. Celia looked at him blankly. She said no. He watched her face for any tell. There was none. She had answered too quickly for it to be a lie, and too honestly for it to be a rehearsal. Ian felt something inside his chest shift, and he did not know whether it was relief or disappointment. He put the necklace into his pocket. He said thank you. He kissed her on the forehead, because he could not think of anything else to do with the moment, and Celia's entire face turned a color he had not previously known human faces could turn. She said something inarticulate. Then she fled the garden. Ian watched her go. He stood alone under the moon for a long time after that. Then he walked back to his dormitory. He did not remember arriving. He remembered opening the door. He remembered the tiredness that had been catching up to him all night finally landing on his shoulders in one heavy wave. He remembered dropping the necklace on the desk and pulling off his coat and falling into bed without changing out of his uniform and closing his eyes with the certainty that he had earned, for the first time in 3 weeks, a full night of sleep. He was wrong. He woke up 7 days later. The sun through his window was too bright again. His head throbbed with a dull, insistent pressure that pushed against the back of his eyes. Ian groaned and turned onto his side, and for one long confused moment he thought he was hungover, and for another long confused moment he thought he was in the wrong bed. He pressed one palm against his temple. He tried to remember the party. He could not remember leaving the party. He could not, in fact, remember anything after Celia had fled the garden. He sat up slowly. The calendar on his wall had moved forward by 7 full days. There were papers on his desk that had not been there when he had gone to sleep. There was a new axe next to the old one, larger than the first, still smelling faintly of oil and someone else's sweat. There was a sealed letter waiting for him on top of the papers, in the same soft handwriting he now recognized on sight, with the same red wax seal he had come to hate. And there was a note pinned to his door, written in a different hand entirely. Ian recognized this second hand too. It belonged to Leto. The note was short. It said only that Ian needed to come find Leto immediately when he woke up, because there were things Leto now knew about the last 7 days that Ian was not going to want to hear from anyone else. It said that Leto had spoken with the person who had been walking around inside Ian's body while Ian was asleep. And it said, at the bottom, in a hand that had trembled slightly, that this person was not a demon. Ian sat on the edge of his bed for a very long time. He looked at the calendar. He looked at the letter on his desk. He looked at the necklace beside the letter, still catching the morning light exactly the way it had caught the moonlight the night before. And he understood, with a slow, cold certainty that he had not yet earned the right to name out loud, that the war he had been fighting for the last 3 weeks had not actually been against a girl named Sepia at all. It had been against himself. A version of himself he had not yet become. A version of himself that was writing him letters from a future that had already ended. And that version, whoever he was not done with Ian yet.